A warm welcome to everyone here. I hope I'm audible. Uh, Father Keith will be joining us soon. However, I would like to welcome faculty in charge Radha ma'am, our lovely audience, and fellow team members as well. We also have some special people among us today. Now, it is an annual ritual for our organization, the Department of Interreligious Studies, to organize a session on Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, which we belovedly call the Ambedkar Lecture. We aim to study and talk about a visionary behind the constitution of our country, a voice that stood against the brutal caste system. But there is so much more to know about him. And today, our guest speaker, Professor Aakash Singh Rathore, will be guiding us through the life of Ambedkar. Professor Aakash Singh Rathore is a philosopher of international repute with good specialization in European and Continental thought, comparative politics, Buddhism, and Ambedkar studies specifically. With a doctorate in political philosophy from the University in Leuven, Belgium, he's also an international fellow at Ethos in Rome and fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla. He has had the great experiences of teaching at Jawaharlal Nehru University, universities of Delhi, Toronto, Pennsylvania, Humboldt, Berlin, and many more. He has authored 9 books in total with meticulous attention to detail, holistic views on different aspects of politics, literature, philosophy, and has also co-authored 2 books, which include Ambedkar's Preamble, A Secret History of the Constitution, and a forthcoming book, which will be released today, Becoming Babasaheb, Birth to Mahadevan. He has also edited 11 books, among which exists the 5-volume anthology published by the Oxford University Press, namely B.R. Ambedkar, The Quest for Justice. Looking at all these achievements and through his lectures, through his conferences, through his talks and discussions throughout the world, he has established himself as one of the most important Ambedkar scholars in the world today. Uniquely, he is also an athlete and ranks as India's #3 Ironman athlete, which is part of one of the most rigorous one-day sporting events. He has graced us earlier with his presence in certain sessions of certificate courses in applied philosophy organized by our college. It's in St. Xavier's College. And we are delighted to have him back today. On behalf of us all, I would like to welcome you, Professor Aakash Singh Rathore, and hope to know your insights on Ambedkar. We also have another special guest with us today, Dr. Kanchana Mahadevan, who will be carefully moderating this session with her experience and professionalism, as I've been made aware of. She currently teaches at the University of Mumbai in the Department of Philosophy, which she has been ahead twice. After having graduated with a master's degree at the University of Mumbai in philosophy, she went on to pursue and receive a doctorate in philosophy at the University of Georgia in 1993. She's very much a philosopher with specialization in continental philosophy, feminist philosophy, ethics, and socio-political philosophy. And she has outreached herself with more interdisciplinary areas such as aesthetics, research methodology, diaspora studies, gender studies, and film and culture studies as well. She has also been teaching assistant at the University of Georgia from 1987 to 1983. To her name, she has also published a book in 2014 entitled Between Femininity and Feminism, Colonial and Post-Colonial Perspectives on Care. She works in the editorial boards of journals like the Indian Philosophical Quarterly, Pluriloque, and the Journal of Social Philosophy. She's also proficient in languages such as English, Hindi, Marathi, Tamil, and German as well. She has covered a wide range of topics through writing papers for seminars and journals, such as on topics such as existentialism, feminism, and more. And several parts have gotten published in anthologies and through wide discussions with scholars of the world. She's an example of human potential as she possesses immense knowledge. I would like to welcome Dr. Kanchana Mahadevan as well for choosing to moderate this session and to grace us with your presence. We have our principal of St. Xavier's College, Dr. Rajendra Shinde, who has taken time out of his busy schedule and has been and is here to listen to this session. I would like Dr. Kanchana Mahadevan to continue as we can start with the session.
Many thanks, Suraj, for your kind words and a lot of expectations as well. Hope I'm able to live up to all that. Many thanks, Professor Radhakumar, for this opportunity. It's a big privilege for me to be here to moderate this session for the talk that Professor Aakash Singh Rathore is going to give. Given the massive body of work that he has given us, it is going to be a very enriching experience listening to him. Moreover, today is the Ambedkar Jayanti, so a very, very special day. So I will just very quickly say something about Ambedkar and say something about Professor Rathore to just get this talk going. You've already introduced us. Thanks a lot. I just want to mention why I think Ambedkar is very important, because a long time before these debates on public religion, a long time before the debates on the relationship between social democracy and political democracy, you have Ambedkar, who has written about these subjects, who has not only written, he's also worked on materializing them on an activist mode. So I think one of his most important insights, several insights, but I'm just picking one up for the day, in keeping with the biographical dimension that Professor Rathore is going to enlighten us on, that the personal and the political are very closely linked together. The social, the personal, the political are all three entangled in some way. And that is precisely why the critique of caste Hinduism becomes very important, because we need to humanize ourselves both at the private level of our personal lives, our personal belief systems. We need to undergo a consciousness change, which we bring to the public domain and engage in a kind of a public use of reason, but a public use of reason that would take the personal and the political into consideration. So in that sense, he is different from Kant. And he also thinks beyond the idea of religion as a ritual. So I was reminded of the word ritual because of Suraj, Ambedkar Memorial Lecture as a ritual. So perhaps we are trying to think beyond the ritual, and we are thinking of it in terms of Dhamma, Ambedkar Memorial Lecture itself as a Dhamma, a moral commitment to the notions of dialogue, public reason, egalitarian reason that communicates without barriers, that communicates without exclusion. And this is what he stood for. So paying tribute to Dr. Ambedkar, I introduce Professor Rathore's work very quickly. You have already introduced him, but I want to say something about two of his works. He's written innumerable books, as we can see, almost 20. Some of them are edited, some of them are authored. His recent work, to which I draw your attention, his authored works, are Philosophy of Autobiography, published by Routledge, and Ambedkar's Preamble published by Penguin, which have been intensely discussed in various fora in Mumbai earlier in the pre-COVID era, as Father Keith put it. And he is also brought out a 5-volume anthology on Ambedkar that has been published by the Oxford University Press, called B.R. Ambedkar, The Quest for Justice. His new book, Becoming Babasaheb, Birth to Mahad, 1891 to 1929, is published by HarperCollins. As a biography of Ambedkar, it's the only one in English that attempts the comprehensive reach that Dhananjay Keer's earlier biography, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Life and Mission, Popular Prakashan, 1954, did. However, he also questions Keer, he also questions Khairmonde, and he questions the archives in LSE and Columbia. Because what he's trying to do here, he's trying to correct the facts and give us the right account of the dates and specificities pertaining to Ambedkar's life. So in this sense, it is almost, Foucault mentioned how the life of the document is the most important dimension. And I think this biography is a kind of a life of a document, and also that documents have flesh and blood. So documents are not these dry things, they have flesh and blood, as he puts it in his preface. He has spent about 10 years researching this in India, United States, and England, walking in the footsteps of Ambedkar. To walk itself is a philosophical act, as we know, beginning with Aristotle. And so that is exactly what has happened here, examining the veracity of documents and so forth. And his biography goes beyond Dhananjay Keer's in many ways. It is far more rigorous, with fidelity to facts. It has thorough documentation. It straddles the local and the global. It concentrates on Ambedkar's stay in London as much as his stay in Mumbai. And it pays a meticulous attention to detail. So I'll invite Professor Rathore to present his lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kanchana. That was very, very nice, and saves me some work of explaining what it was that I was trying to do. Suraj, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, which I'm sure embarrassed Professor Kanchana and me for your high praise and so on. And of course, my thanks to Xavier for the invitation, and express my appreciation to the team for what must be always a lot of work to prepare events like this. Of course, events like this are important on Ambedkar Jayanti, not only for reflection, but also for celebration. And I'm going to begin a bit with something to celebrate, because it only became concrete to my attention with a tweet I read this morning by Santosh Das. Santosh Das has recently published, co-edited a book entitled Ambedkar in London, which I just briefly want to talk about. If I can show here, I think it's visible. The Ambedkar in London is at the center of this top row. What's remarkable about this is that there are 6 books pictured in this small frame. And all of these 6 books about Dr. Ambedkar have been published within the last 6 months. So that's on average 1 book per month in the last 6 months. And I think this is quite extraordinary, and I'm very thrilled that it is happening, that in these years now, after decades of gap, Dr. Ambedkar's life and mission are coming to global attention as it is well deserved. There's something to be cautious about with these 6 books, which I'll mention later. But for the time being, I'd like to briefly discuss the importance of each of these books to shine a light on aspects of Dr. Ambedkar's very complex, multi-dimensional, and multi-layered life. The two that I want to speak about at first are Savita Ambedkar, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar's second wife, her autobiography, and the new biography by Shashi Tharoor, which is entitled Ambedkar, A Life. I couple those because they are so vastly different in a way. Savita Ambedkar's autobiography, it has just been released in English translation, but it has been around in low print numbers in the Marathi original for a couple of decades. But the translation into English, I think, is significant because what Savita Ambedkar's autobiography does is it presents Ambedkar in a way that people have very rarely seen, as a family man, as a husband, as someone with all of the, I can even say, trepidatiously I say it, but I can even say insecurities of, a modern man in the contemporary world. This is, of course, from 1947, when they were married, to 1956 when he died. So we get a wonderful picture of Dr. Ambedkar as a flesh and blood person in Savita Ambedkar's autobiography, and it's a view of his world that I think has, had certainly never been seen, and that really disrupts. Professor Kanchana had spoken about ritual. It really disrupts the way that, in some way, his demigod status, again, merited for various reasons, but this status distances Ambedkar from each of us. It makes him larger than life, and importantly, significantly, makes his struggle and his triumph and his tribulations, all so distant to ourselves and our own lives that we can never imagine achieving anything even analogous to what he had achieved. And this is, of course, a shame, because one of the functions of knowing about great women and men from our history is that they inspire us to be like them and to achieve similar goals. On the other side is Dr. Shashi Tharoor's recent biography. Why he wrote it has mystified many people, because people tend not to understand what his constituency was for writing this book. And of course, he angered many people from his own party and Ambedkarites as well, who think he has tread into spaces he doesn't belong. I can understand that rationale, but there is something to indicate. I personally cannot think of a work about Dr. Ambedkar other than by Kanshiram, where we get the perspective of a great statesman, such as Babasaheb Ambedkar, by another statesman. And I do think it's fair to call Shashi Tharoor a statesman, whatever your politics and disagreements may be. But he has risen to that level on the national and international stage. And so in Shashi Tharoor's biography, which as a biography may not be very innovative, but as an appraisal of Dr. Ambedkar's legacy, which is what the second part of Shashi Tharoor's book does, we get a fascinating insight on how one junior statesman sees one, pioneer statesman. And for that reason, I find the book quite valuable. But to get deeper into Dr. Ambedkar's own life, there are these other two books that offer something very particular. Ambedkar in London and Scott Stroud's, what's the Indian title? This has been published in the United States under a different title. In India, it's published under the title, The Evolution of Pragmatism in India, Ambedkar, Dewey, and the Rhetoric of Reconstruction. Actually, that's the American title, I'm quite sure. But anyway, it's a book that where Scott Stroud focuses on an extremely influential character in Ambedkar's formative development, this influence would last all the way from Ambedkar's time in New York. 1913 it began, but I think 1915, Ambedkar became familiar with Dewey at Columbia University. From 1915 all the way to 1956, we see Ambedkar heavily influenced by John Dewey. And Scott Stroud's book is the first that really delves very deeply into this relationship, providing insights about Ambedkar's time in New York and how his time in New York affected the entire remainder of his long and significant life. The other book, Ambedkar in London, gives something similar, not in New York, but in London, the experiences that Dr. Ambedkar had in London and what kind of lasting impact they would have on his thought and life. So I think these are wonderful, narrow focuses into Dr. Ambedkar's life, or at least two periods in his life. And then the final two I would just mention is Ashok Gopal's recent, I think just now published, very comprehensive intellectual biography of Dr. Ambedkar called Apart, The Life and Thought of B.R. Ambedkar, and my own biography of Ambedkar, which again is a bit opposite to Ashok Gopal's biography in that his is an intellectual biography and mine is a personal biography. Ashok Gopal's biography is really a wonderful work. It is a massive work and difficult to get through, but it's innovative in the way that it comprehensively discusses the writings of Dr. Ambedkar and explores possible influences by looking at all of the authors that Ambedkar would reference in his writings. One thing about Ashok Gopal's book is, of course, that it is an intellectual biography, which means that, like all of the others that I have mentioned, other than Savita Ambedkar's book, we get very little sense of who Ambedkar was as a person. And that's where my book comes in. So you see, there are many books coming out, and they're all wonderful, providing aspects and layers in their own way. The layer that I intend to bring out in my book is Ambedkar as a person, in a way similar to what Savita Ambedkar had done in her autobiography, except that Savita Ambedkar's very intimate look at Dr. Ambedkar is completely void of anything in his life prior to 1947 when they met, and also is not really integrated with the kind of intellectual and legal and academic work that Dr. Ambedkar does. So Savita Ambedkar does mix in the political with the personal in a very lovely way, but the limitations of her own experience and education prevent her from discussing, for example, the academic and the legal and other dimensions of Dr. Ambedkar, which I try to bring out. But given all of this, and I think these 6 books are cause for celebration, although there's a caution I will mention at the end. Given all of this, one has to ask a fundamental question. I've just gone through 6 kinds of biographies, but a fundamental question: what is the use of a biography at all? Why do we even do it? And last night I had a wonderful experience giving a talk and having a discussion with some very insightful discussants. And the question came up by a student of philosophy. She asked, she introduced herself to me and she said, I'm a philosophy student. Is there anything that I can learn from a biography such as this? And I was a bit taken aback by the question, but I understand it. I was, of course, taken aback because I myself am a philosophy student and I wrote the book. So I'm surprised that a philosophy student would question if a philosopher has anything to learn from such a book. To begin to answer that, I'm just going to read one passage, a short passage by Ambedkar himself about biography. So this is from a letter that Dr. Ambedkar wrote to Savita Ambedkar. I'm very fond of literature, particularly biography. Every man's and woman's life is short, and the channel in which it runs is always very narrow. Consequently, the experience of every individual is always very limited, and a limited experience gives a narrow range of sympathies. Unless one is aware of experiences undergone by other people, there is no ennoblement and enrichment in the values of life. I choose what is worth choosing from any author worthy of perusal, and I assimilate into myself and build my own personality, which, if you will allow one to say, is not an imitation of anybody, howsoever high. It is my own original self. The fact that Dr. Ambedkar had held in such high esteem and high value biographies really motivated me to continue to write this biography, which in all honesty was very difficult task to complete. But I would always think back at how important Ambedkar himself thought biography was. His argument is that through biography, one can transcend one's own experiences, the limitations of one's own experiences. Those limitations are, of course, social location, historical situations, culture, all of these kinds of identities and constraints that we face. And of course, some of them are conscious and we're aware of them, and so many of them are unconscious and we remain unaware of them. What biographies do is allow us to transcend these limitations to some degree, puncture through our narrow channel of experiences and engage sympathetically, imaginatively in and participate in the life of others who could be completely dissimilar to us, others whom we may not even like as far as we know or our prejudices lead us to believe. Others, on the other hand, from whom we can learn, and others, such as I personally believe, upon whom I would like to model myself. Ambedkar mentions that it is my own original self, as he states, that he creates by choosing what he will from the biographies that he reads. So there are stories of the biographies that Ambedkar liked to read, including that of Tolstoy, which is the biography he was attempting to get his fiancée Savat Ambedkar, at that time named Shada Kabir, he was attempting to get her to read the biography of Tolstoy, and she was reluctant to do it essentially because of the great sadness and tragedies that Tolstoy had to suffer in his life, and she found it quite depressing. So this paragraph Ambedkar wrote in order to convince her that you shouldn't read just the things that you agree with or that make you happy. In order to broaden our horizons, you transcend yourself by getting into the life of a man such as Tolstoy, including all of the dark times, and you see how he overcame them to achieve a kind of greatness. Becoming Babasaheb, this biography, I think does a couple of things. One is, of course, it introduces the trials and the triumphs of Dr. Ambedkar to show how it is that he did construct his own original self, as he calls it. What decisions he made, what decisions were imposed upon him, what circumstances he faced, and what he chose to do in each of them. And by watching this story evolve, we see how this particular person, against millions or billions of odds, became the world historical figure that we now all know and celebrate on a day such as today. But at the same time, my personal motivation in some respects comes from what Dr. Ambedkar had said, that only when we know these stories do we have the material from which we can pluck and choose and in some way augment our own personalities and our own aspirations, take or receive a kind of boost from the decisions that one of our predecessors made. So the story of how Babasaheb created himself seems to me to also provide the ingredients in some respect for how each of us can create our own selves, model on the achievements of such a great person. So becoming Babasaheb is both a narrative of how he came to be who he was, and also a narrative designed to guide the reader in some respects on how she might incorporate some of those aspects in order to fulfill her own ambitions. Now, of course, becoming Babasaheb was not a sheer act of will on his part. It was a consequence of a vortex of circumstances, so many well beyond his control. Historical ripeness. He happened to be born in a historical era that in some way needed him. Social location, again, had he been born, for example, in another caste or class, things would have been very different. Chance encounters. All of these circumstances provided the framework that offered him the possibility for making decisions, for choosing to do one thing versus another, that allowed his evolution to go in precisely that direction that we all know as being so significant today. As an example of how things could have been totally different, I want to just introduce you to something that I know you do not know, because I had to discover it by entering the secret archives of the India office in London, archives that are held where the British government till today doesn't allow you to take any photographs or even pad and paper. so that these documents don't get wide circulation. What I found in the India office was that there was a period when a youngish Dr. Ambedkar, after he had already returned from London as a qualified barrister and had begun his legal practice, but also begun his social activism and work in the legislature of the Bombay Legislative Council. So we're talking about after 1927. When a politician, B.G. Kher from the Congress Party, who later became the Chief Minister of Bombay State, at that time called Prime Minister of Bombay State, when this politician was in communications with the Viceroy of India and the Secretary of State to conspire to have Dr. Ambedkar appointed as a High Court judge in Bombay. Now, of course, that hardly seems like a conspiracy. To be appointed High Court judge in Bombay is not only a great honor, it was a huge appeal to Dr. Ambedkar himself. Throughout Ambedkar's life, he never managed to secure a steady income, steady salary. From the youngest days all the way until his death, he had no capital whatsoever, and in fact died insolvent and owing money. So a judgeship would provide a regular income and a handsome one. And it would also provide profound respect for a person who had arisen from social circumstances such as his own, to have everybody in the court of whichever caste mandated to adhere to, what you say, would be a source of great pride and satisfaction. And then, of course, there was the intellectual appeal. A judge, especially a High Court judge, spends the majority of her time reading and studying and writing, which were the things that Dr. Ambedkar liked to do most. In fact, that he personally preferred than marching on the street and this kind of grassroots activism. He was, after all, by constitution, an intellectual. And then the fact that he wouldn't be reading anything, but he would be reading questions of law. This very much appealed to him, as he was always extremely attracted to finer points and nuances in law and jurisprudence. So there are many, many reasons why Dr. Ambedkar would have been very much lured by an offer of a High Court judgeship. But why do I call it a conspiracy then? The reason why the politician, Kher, wanted this judgeship offered to Dr. Ambedkar was precisely because judges are not permitted to engage in politics. They're not permitted to make public rallying speeches to alert a community of the injustices that they are suffering at the hands of course, the wider community, but also possibly the government. In other words, the judgeship would have ended the political and legislative and social career of Dr. Ambedkar, and thereby eliminated a very, very powerful competitor to the interests of the Congress Party at that time in Bombay. So it's fascinating to think that Ambedkar could easily, around the time that he's 40 years old, could have easily moved into the High Court. And the question in my mind is, would any of us know his name today if that had happened? Can you name any High Court judges from 1940, 1950? I'm sure you can't. Things would have been very different, not only in the course of Dr. Ambedkar's life, not only in the course of the lives of his community members who he impacted so significantly. As you can see just by going out in public today, you see the hoardings and the boards and all of the festivities around Dr. Ambedkar, precisely because of how much he had done for his community. But even well beyond his community, it would have changed, altered the lives of every single one of us. Our worlds would have been entirely different had Ambedkar made just that one choice, just that one choice. And what I try to do in the book, Becoming Babasaheb, is show choice after choice that he made, given alternatives. Should he go to Baroda? Should he not go to Baroda? Should he go to New York or should he go to London? I don't think many people know the original scholarship that Dr. Ambedkar received from the Maharaja was not to go to New York, but it was to go to London. And they chose New York instead. So there are many, many choices that made Ambedkar become Babasaheb. And any of these choices could have been different, and all of our history would have been different as a consequence. Now, our world has, of course, evolved a great deal since the time of Babasaheb's death. It's evolved a great deal in general in these last 70, 75 years, and it's evolved in very promising ways in terms of social justice, thanks to his work and also the work of so many others, social justice and civil rights and our essential liberties and freedoms. But there are other ways in which it has not changed very much at all. Now, I had mentioned in the start these 6 books as a cause for celebration, but there's also something about them that should give us caution. You look at each of them, each of the 6, they are all authored by non-Dalits. Each of these 6 books has been authored or written by people who are not from this community. Why should that be the case? Obviously, the kinds of exclusions and the unjust social backdrop that was intense in Ambedkar's day continues in our own day right to this moment, often, of course, explicitly when it comes to atrocity and violence, but also very implicitly in academia, in publishing. And the fact remains that as much as we have evolved and progressed, we have to remain cautious about the ways that exclusions continue and that we are party to these exclusions. Because these exclusions are systemic, they're not necessarily conscious. By my decade-long effort to bring out a biography, comprehensive biography of the life and interior life and personality of Babasaheb, my aim was not to elbow out, let's say, a Dalit author or a woman author or another person with more lived experience of that kind of marginalization. My aim was not to elbow out such a person, but one has to be conscious that it is an inevitable result. And when you get a battery of books, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all by non-Dalit authors, you start to see a kind of juggernaut of what we can call appropriation of Ambedkar's life and even his movement. So while it is a cause for celebration that this recognition is becoming not only national, but global, international, it is also a reminder of the continued circumstances of both massive forms of prejudice, discrimination, and exclusion, and also very subtle forms that affect each of us, you at Xavier's College, me, and all of us who are living the life of the mind or the academic life, that this exclusion continues today, and we have to be cautious and attempt to do our part to bring it to an end. So with that, I close, and I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to any remarks of the chair or audience.
Thank you, Professor Aakash, for your very interesting and intriguing delving into these several biographies that have been published in recent years from 2020 to 23, so many of them. And as you say, there is a certain discomfort, and you pointed this out very well. The discomfort of, towards the end of your talk, that there are so many, that each of them is written by non-Dalits, and this is certainly a cause for concern. This reminds me also of that book, The Hatred in the Belly, you know, where Arundhati Roy's long introduction to the annihilation of caste was articulated and critiqued because her introduction turned out to be larger than the text, Ambedkar's text itself. She wrote more about Gandhi than Ambedkar. And why is it that Savarnas are asked to come and write on a subject that they know nothing about? That was the critique. And as you point out, it is showing a certain inherent poverty, a poverty of the mind, a poverty of the Indian mind itself, that is reflected because of the material conditions, of the lack of resources that underprivileged castes have to education and so forth. So they are not able to be in a position to write this out. So this brings up for me a very crucial question. To what degree can we really engage with Savarna scholarship or non-Dalit scholarship on Ambedkar or Dalit issues itself? Can there be any authenticity at all in that? And how do we, then what do we do with this kind of scholarship that is all around? This is a very, very, I think, central question that you've articulated. There are several there are some who have raised your hands. I'll come to you. Just give me a couple of seconds more. The other question is the philosophical one. And this is something I have been also struggling with. The philosophy community constantly making this allegation that what is so philosophical about Ambedkar and so forth. And you brought out this whole idea of self-fashioning and constructing the self, you know, and in that sense, Ambedkar is someone who constructed himself. We all construct ourselves, so we don't go in for an essentialist idea of identity, which often, I think, comes in some peculiar ways in the philosophical context, where we think of the human subject as sattva, rajas, and tamas, you know, so the three gunas. And Ambedkar himself has a critique of this. And this is a kind of a cliche that keeps going around, which essentializes people. So the whole idea is of thinking about others as we create ourselves, and that there is a certain self-other relationship in which the construction of the self happens. And isn't that a very deeply philosophical question? So that is a very, very interesting point that you brought up. It also reminded me of your earlier work on autobiography, the philosophy of autobiography, where you had this in your chapter on Ambedkar. You know, you have brought out this whole notion of how those who are socially oppressed are often asked this question, who are you? Because we see this all around. Mumbai is surrounded by construction sites, and our lungs reflect that. I mean, so we are our surroundings, because I think most of us are swallowing cement all the time. And we do see some fancy restaurants around where construction workers are not allowed to enter, and the right of entry reserved. This is something we take for granted, as we are haunted by the, let me quote yours, Steinbeck and Springsteen, the ghost of Tom Joad continues to haunt us as we look at this right to entry reserved. Everybody can't enter every place. And this is, as you put it in your chapter, in your book on autobiography, Ambedkar was always asked this question, who are you? And he had to answer this question if he had to get into a transport, if he had to look for a place to stay, if he even had to drink water, he had to answer this question, who are you? So obviously that kind of an identity question, which is posed in such a humiliating and a very primordial way, foregrounds the need for self-fashioning, foregrounds the need for self-creation and so forth, which Ambedkar, I think, has articulated and brought out. So the idea of rising beyond the narrow world and thinking about others, that is one way, but it is also, I think, about, that is the ideal way of looking at it. But at another level, you have to keep constructing your identity, because you have to keep explaining to people who you are, because they essentialize you, they stigmatize you, and you're resisting that stigma by saying, I'm not that, I'm not just that. You are trying to put me in a position of bad faith by defining me, putting me into a container, but I'm not just that. So it is, I think, that whole struggle also that is linked to this idea of autobiography and biography, as you put it in your earlier book. And moreover, the Savita Ambedkar reference that you brought out to her work, it is a partially autobiographical and a partially biographical work. So isn't autobiography and biography somewhere mixed up in some sense, where one is not really objectifying, but where one is actually caught up in an intensely difficult position of thinking from the first person point of view, as we are entangled with so many others who enter our lives? And can we really draw a line between the two? And if we can't, then isn't that precisely, as you put it, because the personal is the political? These are some of the comments I had to your very, very interesting and fascinating lecture. I look forward to reading your new book, which I haven't. So it's something I look forward to doing over the weekend. So Professor Mangesh Kulkarni is here with us. He is a professor of political science at the Pune University and Savitribai Phule Pune University. He has a question. Professor Kulkarni, please.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Kanchana Mahadevan. Quickly, two questions. One is purely factual. This is about Dr. Ambedkar's financial status. You said he died an insolvent. I was really not quite aware of that, because I thought during his, public career, especially in the later years, he was offered and he took up many prestigious and, I believe, lucrative government assignments. I'm not saying that this negatively. I must emphasize that it's not that showy kind of thing. I genuinely believe that he was financially fairly well off. Especially, I remember going to college every day to Ruia, walking past his sort of mansion, Raja Graha, which I believe was built around his library. I never could enter it, but I always thought that therefore he was quite well off later in life. One. Second is something politically really incorrect, but I must say this. See, by now we have in India Dalit middle class. We have huge number of, in my own university, for example, professors, etc. I mean, at all levels, drawn from from that background. And in fact, I must say this: most of them from a particular community in which Dr. Ambedkar was born, which has in fact generated internal kinds of sort of antagonism, etc., which we won't go into now. The question is, so therefore there is no lack of opportunity, believe me. I mean, I've been part of this system for all my life. I'm on the point of retirement. And there are people like, my former colleague, I mean, people who were in my department, Gopal Guru, or elsewhere in English, Department of English, Aniket Xavier, who have done excellent work coming from that background. And there are people, huge numbers of people, like huge numbers of upper caste people don't produce anything meaningful in our profession. Huge numbers of Dalits do not produce anything. It's nothing, believe me, nothing to do with lack of opportunity. It's not true. I'm sorry, because our speaker, he's very eminent and he's a very cosmopolitan kind of person, but at least this much I can say. See, I've been wallowing in this all my life, this field. I know it. Okay, that's it basically for now.
Kanchana, shall I respond?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mangesh, nice to hear from you. I can't see you. I'm trying to understand how to see on Zoom, but I'm not able to. About the first question, your surprise, even when Dr. Ambedkar died in 1956, he owed a debt of 20,000 rupees for the construction of Rajgruh. And it was at constant risk of being taken away from him. In an exchange of letters in 1947, even Savita Ambedkar was very surprised when Dr. Ambedkar mentioned that if you choose to marry me, just understand you will be living a life of poverty. And she was very surprised. He had become so famous, he had held so many important positions that he had no money whatsoever. He had to self-fund his research, his writing. There was a letter when Dr. Ambedkar completed the Buddha and his Dhamma, he exchanged letters with Prime Minister Nehru asking for a kind of grant so it could be published. And Nehru said, this is not going to be possible. So he was, under his own expense, doing research, writing, publication. And he never managed, and of course the journals the printers, the printing and all of these things, he never managed to accumulate any wealth at all. And for this reason, even his wife was ejected from their house shortly after his death because they couldn't cover the rent. So while he had some steady positions, well, not steady, but he had some government positions for short durations, they were still all contingent, nothing permanent. And he never managed to amass any money, and he died in debt. As for lack of opportunity, I understand your experiences, Mangesh, but I would defer to the experiences of those who are in positions that are closer to the ground realities there. And I'll just tell you my own experience as an editor, as a series editor, and as an academic. I receive and participate in all kinds of editorial decisions, publication decisions, and I myself have seen, contrary to what you have experienced from my point of view, I have seen a preference for the passing and publication of persons with certain social standing over newcomers. And obviously, given that the education of the Dalits who have fortunately forged a sizable middle class now, that education is still only 1 to 2 generations in the making. And so the authors from those communities are by no means established authors who get published easily. So what I have seen in the last 20 years in the publication and academic publication side of things is a very explicit exclusion of Dalit authors and Dalit scholars, and an inability for them to be published in comparison to myself. I mean, I entered academia with ease, and I entered academic publishing with even greater ease. And in the attempt to get Dalit authors published, which I have taken on as a task for the last 20 years, I've noticed a much greater resistance than when I suggest for publication persons from other social backgrounds. So I think our experiences can differ in this, and I would just maybe encourage you to see that, you know, you do have your experience, and I'm sure it's legitimate in its perspective, but other people have other experiences, and I think they are also certainly legitimate.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Aakash, Professor Mangesh, for your conversation. There is on the chat box, there is a message from Amber. As for Professor Mangesh's second question, there is something called gatekeeping. Almost no Dalit graduates are hired in India's mainstream media. I would say that from the location of philosophy, again, not much, very, very meager writing by Dalit scholars. And I'm not sure if that kind of opportunity I have seen Dalits enjoy over my long period in the academic world. I have seen a certain divide again within the premises of my university, a huge gap, which is something that has bothered me a great deal. So it's extremely complex. We are also hearing about so many students who student suicides, for example. You know, I didn't want to say this today, but then Dalit students committing suicide, that is, I think, enough ground gives us enough ground to think about something very unfortunate. Racism and casteism do not exist in the 19th century forms. So no one is going to tell someone, don't drink from that water cooler. But there is another kind of discrimination, I think, that is quite prevalent in the academic context, and so forth. And that is something we'll have to think through. Yeah. Yes, Professor Kulkarni, do you want to say what you have written about the scholars from privileged castes writing on Ambedkar? You have some perspectives in the chat. Maybe you could yourself bring it to our attention, or would you like me to read them out?
Yeah, thank you. Very, very, very quickly, all I want to say is, imagine if Marx was a bourgeois, Engels' father was a mill owner. I mean, had they not written about the working class, where would we be? Or say Mill or Phule as men, wrote about women's oppression. So we should take that kind of stand. And Ambedkar himself learned a lot from the Buddha, from number of authors whose caste he never bothered about. That's one thing. Very quickly. Secondly, is take somebody like Ashok. I have known him for a long time, and I was beginning to think that he wasn't actually writing a book. But finally, because he has taken such a long time, and from what I've seen of, he doesn't have a regular job. he is sort of a freelance kind of a researcher, and I think he's plowed a really long furrow. So I think they deserve appreciation. I mean, really. I mean, and today I have so many colleagues across departments here and elsewhere. They have every opportunity, lakhs of rupees by way of grants, a job that gives them 2 to 3 lakh rupees a month. What prevents them? I mean, for God's sake, I don't see this. Sabbaticals, you name it, foreign trips, if you like, everything is available. ICSR funding, ICHR funding, ICPR funding. I mean, let's be honest. I know, of course, the vast Dalit masses and indeed non-Dalit masses in this country are still greatly deprived. There's no doubt about it. But let's not just go into some kind of standpoint epistemology kind of stuff and some sort of PC kind of stuff, which I think is self-defeating, to be very honest. And believe me, it's feeding precisely to the right-wing upsurge. Believe me, this kind of, and the left is painting itself into a corner. The progressives are doing that.
Professor Kulkarni, you brought up a very interesting issue, leaving aside the opportunity, because I do think that the same can be said about women, that how many opportunities and so forth, so how come? And so one has to look at the larger picture, as you yourself admitted, the larger masses, the availability of facilities at the school level, at the entry point, the possibility of being taken seriously when one writes, the difficulty of finding a voice, etc. I don't know, so many issues there. We can talk about this because this is a highly, this is a perspective this is a theme that we can keep on having a back and forth. And as you say, we should honestly do that, and that's important, I would agree. But to just quickly come to this point about this non-Dalits writing about Dalits, that is a good thing, as you said. That's important, that should be taken seriously. Of course it is. And of course it is being taken seriously. And but then, is it really leading to a critique by those who are privileged about their own identities? Is it really sort of getting us away from the subtler forms of caste discrimination that have come to dominate our academic world and so forth? These are questions to think about. And are we taking the question of representation into account? And yes, men writing about women, that was a very important point. You brought up Engels and Mill and so forth. Marx writing about the working class on a parallel note. Marx himself coined the notion of standpoint. So we need to think about what is the meaning of standpoint. Is that social determinism? Do we need to slip into this perspective where we say that only those who directly, personally suffer the oppression on a first hand can even think about that oppression? What is the meaning of experience? I think these are some critical questions that come up. But then there are so many questions in the chat box that I would have to sort of suspend this and get to the next point. Sorry about leaving this midway. There are two perspectives, two standpoints perhaps, and maybe we could talk about it at greater length later on. Thank you.
Professor Kanchana, can I come in?
Yeah, please come in.
Yeah, I think one needs to see the kind of poverty that he led in a very different perspective. Whether similarly like that of Phule, he spent all whatever he earned by way of being a contractor, spent all his for the moment. And in the last days of his, you say people had to write to him, backward ruler, to give him funding of 30 rupees a month. That was Phule's condition, but he spent. Regarding Dr. Ambedkar, not that he entered into debt in the sense that all others entered into debt. He spent all that. Remember, I have seen the kind of library that Siddharth College has. It is one of the most wonderful libraries. You have all the journals. He spent all that money for that. You have Hansard's debates there. You have all contemporary review. You have 19th century review. The kind of books that Siddharth College has, very few college libraries have. And all that, those books were purchased by Dr. Ambedkar. So it is not that he did not earn money. He earned money spent for his people. It was not that when he said, it is in the matter of saying that you may not have the kind of luxurious life that you might expect that you have married a barrister. So it is in that respect, because he was spending everything what he earned for his own people, for the movement. And therefore, so the kind of library I have seen, I worked in the Siddharth College library, is something that many people forget. You say, you have wonderful art. Maharashtra State Archives has wonderful they say files on Mahadevan movement and everything. But the way he spent money, not just because of to keep the Rajguru up, to the upkeep of Rajguru. So this is one important thing one want to say, because most of these people led a life of whatever they earned, they spent for the movement. And therefore, it was not something like to have a very fat bank balance or something like this. That is where they entered into debt. Not because for his personal reasons or anything. He spent everything for the kind of thought that he believed in. So this is one important thing. As far as non-Dalit writing, there are some very good works by Dalit writers in Marathi. If at all one is to consider only English writings, then you can say it is. But there are some people who have, Dalit people, who have written excellent works on Dr. Ambedkar in Marathi. I felt that some of those works need to be translated into English. And some of his co-workers, some of those who work with Dr. Ambedkar, so they have written very good work in Marathi, but that is in Marathi. So it is, and so far as publishing is concerned, let me also say that it is not concerned with Savarna or Varna. They say publishers have different, even I have published 5 books, but despite publishing 5 books, Professor Kanchana, you also know that, and I would like to tell Professor Saab that how the publishers view, you have a background of Cambridge and Oxford, in India, most of the publishers will run after you. You say that you are from Bombay University, I know how people take time to publish your work. So it is not that Savarna or other people, who do the work. So this is, I think there is much more than to see in his career. Why he goes right from Southwick Borough Commission, where he said, I'm not going to die as a Hindu. That too in 1980, they say 18, Southborough Commission, the evidence that he gave. See, after that, one got to look into a number of other things, and in the entire context, I will say why, and I felt one need to see much more than what it is written today. Not just because of factual details, but one need to, what I found today is that why such a person does not join even Asiatic Society, being so close to Asiatic Society. It is an Asiatic Society, see people, he had an agenda to work with. He not only wanted to uplift his people, but he wanted philosophically to fight the upper caste hegemony. And therefore, he had to write, even to write Dhamma, he took the help of R.P. Kangle. And say scholars like that. It is not that he was, so I think one need to see much more than what it is today. And though Professor Saab has given a good explanation, I think much more need to be looked into even today. And
thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, Professor Ganachari. You brought up some critical issues. We cannot resolve everything today.
Yes.
So this is, we just have a couple of hours, not even a couple of hours now, about, I think, 40 minutes to go, right? So we cannot resolve everything. So
But
we will have to.
nevertheless, the presentation was excellent. Nevertheless.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There are some questions on the chat box.
Kanchana,
Yeah.
if I can just make a
Yeah,
small
sure.
comment.
Sorry.
No,
Yes,
no, it's okay. It's
I'm
okay.
sorry. Yeah.
No, I just want
Because
to say
there are
that,
so many questions on the chat box. I was getting
Yes.
a bit anxious. We don't want to exclude anyone as we talk of being inclusive. Yeah.
I know.
Sorry.
No, I just want. I don't want to say anything at length. I just want to thank Professor Ganachari for those comments that I think are very significant, very insightful. I agree with each of the three points. I wanted to just add about his mentioning of the Marathi literature and the translation and so on, that this, in fact, augments what it is that I'm trying to say. There's a decision, Nadeem Khan, whom you possibly know, the translator of Savita Ambedkar's autobiography into English, has himself spoken publicly on how easy it was to have Savita Ambedkar's autobiography translated into English by a major press, and how he's faced total resistance to having any biographies of Ramabai Ambedkar translated into English by the same publisher or other big publishers like Penguin, HarperCollins, Oxford, and so on. So the reality of the exclusion is not only geographical location, but also social location is verified by everybody I know who works in publishing. And I've not only have I seen it, I've unfortunately been forced to participate in it at times when my objection or my attempt to publish an author was overruled by those who felt that this person was merely representing caste interests or something of the sort, So I 100% I'm thankful for your intervention, and I think it's all correct. But I want to say that the second point you made, I don't think contradicts what I'm trying to say, but in fact enhances or enforces it. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Rathore. We have a very short timeline because I had assumed that it will go until 12:30. We have to wind up by 12. And at the most, we can go on for another 5 to 10 minutes, maybe, to take liberty. So let's quickly go through these questions on the chat box. Professor Amit Valmiki has a question: how conflicting history that is biography can be extracted, and how exact can it be? Sorry, how conflicting history that is biography, how can it be exact, and how much personal intervention distorts or exacts biography? That is a question. She also has a comment to that discussion very quickly, that it is not about money or funding. Her own surname is the cause of a great deal of everyday humiliation and everyday lack of recognition, and so forth, in the context of our discussion. Yeah, so do you want to respond to that, Professor Rathore? The question, how exact can it be, biography?
Yeah, this is
conflicting histories. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, this is a huge question, and we're short on time, but it is a very insightful question. So I just want to point out two things. One, anyone working with empirical data, documents in archives, dealing with facts and so on, as opposed to advanced research and theory, is cognizant of introducing too much subjectivity, or, to take Professor Kanchana's own position, too little subjectivity into the narrative. But a second thing that I would like to point out, which has never been discussed, as far as I'm aware, anywhere in the world, is that I myself, as an academic who transitioned to trade publishing, commercial publishing, have been completely astonished by the lack of fact-checking done by commercial publishers. So when I work with Oxford University Press, for example, each book undergoes at least 3 rounds of peer review and so on to check both method and facts. When you work with trade publishers, and these are the largest publishers in the world, Penguin, HarperCollins, Macmillan, and so on, nobody checks anything at all. And I think this is cause for alarm, especially in today's world, in the kind of post-fact world where ideologies triumph over data, and fake news has more saleability than real news. When these commercial publishers are interested in sales, more interested in sales than facts, I think we will see that the commitment to facts slowly disintegrates. And I believe I've seen that in certain recent books about the Constituent Assembly and other works. So I introduced that new idea that I think none of you would ever have heard. I do think it's particularly dangerous not to inject some subjectivity, but in the publishing world, I think we have the larger danger that books like our news shows are made now for sales rather than for discoveries of the truth.
Thank you so much. There is a question by Dr. Alok Tandon, who's a philosopher from Lucknow, on the chat. Why is there appropriation or glorification of Ambedkar by political parties, and yet no one seems to be serious about fighting the systematic discrimination that he has articulated?
I think you can answer this, Kanchana.
No, you are the author, you are the speaker, so you should. I've been talking a lot.
Okay, I don't have any insight on this greater than anyone else, but it almost seems the question is rhetorical, because everybody knows that the pursuit of self-interest, human nature given what it is, and our systems, political, economic systems being what they are, that we are inevitably drawn towards making shows and spectacles of engagement rather than the huge personal sacrifice that it takes to do substantive work.
Yeah, thank you. And Rachel Andrews has a question. What inspired you to study Dr. Ambedkar's life and work?
Dr. Ambedkar inspired me. At my marriage, about 20 years ago, at the ceremony, I was married under photograph of course, a statue of the Buddha and a photograph of Dr. Ambedkar, and I was quite mesmerized. Having grown up predominantly in the United States, even though my father was a professor at Columbia and I spent my childhood on the Columbia campus, even though I was a student at London School of Economics, even though I was a law student, all of these parallels and overlaps with Dr. Ambedkar, I had never discovered or been introduced to Ambedkar almost precisely until the day of my marriage. But since that day, seeing how much he meant to my family, and then to their community, and what impact he had, as I was slowly introduced, I saw it rippling out in so many ways. It was inevitable that I should become addicted to exploring and understanding him. And he's become an icon for me, a role model, and I will pursue this for as long as I'm able.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dr. Meenu Chandra has a question. Did Babasaheb acknowledge the contribution of his contemporaries in his success?
Yes, one can always say, did he do it enough? Like with each of us, every day, I wonder, who I have not given due recognition to for what I've learned and what I say and so on. One can say that that none of us does enough. But what's fascinating, if you look at it, all of his public speeches, they are full of praise. In fact, there's a very, very fascinating letter that Dr. Ambedkar wrote when he was nominated to the Bombay Legislative Council in 1927. He was nominated in 26, joined in 1927. He wrote a letter to a friend that he is already engaged in so much. His clothes are threadbare. He gets no sleep. And it's taken such a toll on his family to pursue his academic work, to pursue his lawyering, to pursue his publications and all of the other ventures he was engaged in, that there is no way he is going to be a competent legislator or politician without the help of the community. And as he mentions, it is only the community that can get this done, and not me, myself alone. So he was extremely cognizant of it, as he articulated to one of his very close friends.
Thank you so much. There is Pallavi Gamre. Gamre, are you still here online? Do you want to ask your, do you want to speak to us?
I just wanted to comment, and I did that on the chat.
Yeah,
I don't want to ask anything.
Okay, so can I read your comment out then?
Sure, no problem. Thank you.
Or will you read it out, your own comment? Why don't you read it out, Pallavi?
Okay. Just give me a second. So I was just saying that I am a third generation neo-Buddhist. My ancestors converted to Buddhism during Diksha of 1956. So I was saying that thanks to my father's education and then his class 1 government job, I did not face any caste problems in terms of social treatments and education, especially education. But I have seen my community was still trying to reach upwards because of n number of reasons today. And I've also seen that livelihood had always been an important part, much bigger than, a complete formal education. And it still does to many. I have seen people from my own generation still trying to struggle between a livelihood and education, and obviously livelihood prevails, weighs more. And to develop, like what Professor Aakash said, that why Dalit writers are not as not on the higher platform as writers such as Tharoor, is because to write something, to research something extensively, one has to develop a thorough analytical mind enough to research and write extensively. And according to my knowledge, it is possible only by a very good education system. And I've seen my community, as I told, trying to earn livelihood and education takes a back seat because of which. So that's why I was trying to say that I understand where Professor Rathore, comes from while putting that point. That's it.
Do you want to respond to that, Professor Rathore?
Well, I think it's very insightful. It is, of course, not just caste, but the intersection of caste with gender, with class, and so on that that creates the circumstances for what one will experience, whether one experiences the kind of discrimination or not. My wife is a second generation, and I witnessed firsthand how much prejudice she faces. And I think a large part of it is because of gender mixed with caste, not just caste. She has colleagues of the same caste who could say the same thing or do the same thing and yet not experience the backlash that she experiences. So, there's the intersection that really makes a difference on how one experiences discrimination in the world. So I appreciate your point very much.
Then finally, Dr. Alok Tandon has a question. We can perhaps close with this because we are already 7 minutes over time. So why was Ambedkar, though he was a modernist and product of enlightenment, so keen on joining a religion instead of rejecting it wholly?
What a fascinating question. This is a very long story that goes back to Ambedkar's childhood upbringing, very early years, when he discusses how his father imposed upon him and his brother to recite prayers and to every evening meet in the home temple to pray and sing bhajans, all the way up to in fact the last few hours of his life when he mentions refuge in the Buddha as being the source of peace amidst a life of chaos. So it's something that covered the arc of his entire life. And I don't think his rationalism or modernism, as you call it, was that kind that went hand in hand necessarily with a rejection of all of the fruits of religious attitude and religious feeling and religious sentiment. Before we close, Professor Kanchana Mahadevan is in fact completing a book on precisely this topic. So I think Professor Tandon, you should have a look at what she's coming out with to see the various ways that religion and modernity are intertwined and productive as well as antagonistic.
I don't know why. Before I joined on Zoom, I felt pretty light. But ever since this discussion started this is the second moment towards the end, I'm feeling pretty nervous and heavy. Anyway, that's a personal problem. And one last point that Ember brought up. Ember, do you want to come online and just read out your message, or are you here? Or shall I read it out? Yeah, Ember's here online. Okay, Ember writes that representation matters. No Brahmin, even Marxists, would write annihilation of caste. Simone de Beauvoir says it in The Second Sex, but she said it in the late 40s, that it would take a woman to write The Second Sex to document all of these little ways in which women are discriminated because that is something they experience. But then one would also have to think about the larger question. I think that Professor Ganachari, Professor Rathore, and Professor Kulkarni brought up today, that there is the other dimension of also not being determined by one's social location, that too, because Marx was not, as Professor Kulkarni said, working class person, but he wrote so much for the working classes. So the truth is somewhere there. Yeah, we are living in a post-truth world, so I won't use the term truth. The meaning is somewhere in between, maybe. No, she didn't really put it in that sense, Professor Kulkarni, that no man would ever reflect on his gender, but then the idea of today with the masculinity studies, yes, she has been proved wrong, you're right, because so much of problematizing of the masculine identity itself has happened, but much of it is also coming in the wake of feminism too. So somewhere women started doing the gender problematization, gender bending, and men also have started doing it, and it's important. Dr. Jayant, this is definitely the last point. Dr. Jayant Nanda Gowli says, I don't think that anybody can be Mahapurush or Superman without addressing the root problem of the society, that is the caste system. Talking so much on humanity and religion and so on, but not taking any efforts to destroy the caste system. Would you want to say something to this? This quote or this message?
I think it's self-explanatory. There are a lot of varying positions and opinions, but I do recognize that that sentiment.
So we will end here now. It is 12:13. I have been bargaining for time, and the maximum I could bargain for is 12:15. So we got 2 minutes more to 12:15. Thank you, every one of you who has joined today, for your participation, very active participation, for your extremely enriching comments, questions, conversation. Many thanks to Professor Rathore for his thought-provoking discussion on the whole idea of biography and autobiography, and the kinds of questions it generates, primarily, I think, political, social, and philosophical questions, because who am I is, I think, the most central philosophical question. So in some sense, this whole book, Becoming Babasaheb, is perhaps a philosophical work here. Not perhaps, it is a philosophical work. And also the question of becoming, that the self is not a given, the self is a process, a work in process, a becoming filled with contradictions. I think this is something we've been learning from the philosophers of the 20th century and now the 21st century. But one question I think that we could think about in the light of our discussion today and Professor Rathore's whole talk is, can those who are oppressed in some sense by gender, caste, and so forth, and can they avoid the notion of the self at all? Can we talk about simply getting rid of the notion of the self and the death of subjectivity, or dissolving the subject completely? Can one think in that direction? This too is something we need to reflect on, but that is for another occasion. Many thanks to Professor Radha Kumar and Professor Keith D'Souza, Professor Shinde of St. Xavier's College, and all the students and colleagues at St. Xavier's who have put in so much of effort to making this conversation possible on this day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. I understand we all were so engaged in this enlightening conversation, but due to our time constraints, we have to conclude this lecture soon. So first, I would like to extend my thanks to our speaker, Professor Aakash Singh Rathore, for taking out his precious time from his busy schedule. And I'm sure all of us have our own takeaways from this lecture. Thank you to our today's lecture moderator, Professor Kanchana Mahadevan, for her efficient and smooth moderation. I would also like to thank Rector of St. Xavier's and Director of DIRS, Dr. Father Keith D'Souza, Principal Professor, Dr. Rajendra Shinde, and Faculty Advisor of DIRS, Professor Radha Kumar, for their constant guidance and support to us. Thank you to the student of DIRS for organizing this lecture. And yes, many faculties of our college joined this lecture today. Thank you to them as well. And last but not the least, I would like to thank our lovely audience as well for their interest and attentive presence. We hope you had a beautiful time with us. There will be a feedback form also in the chat box. And I kindly request you all to fill that form in the chat box. Do give same kind of love or more than that for our next events too. Thank you.